Welcome to a story that asks, what is the true cost of paradise? Janelle Brown's What Kind of Paradise is a mesmerizing journey that spans two entirely different worlds, the silent, isolated wilderness of mid-90s Montana and the dizzying, nascent digital chaos of boom-era San Francisco. At the heart of this narrative is Jane, a young woman whose entire reality is built on her father's carefully constructed lies. She was raised off the grid, shielded from what her father deemed the corrupting influence of civilization and technology, living a rigid philosophical life based on the supposed innocence of nature. But innocence, like isolation, is a fragile thing. When Jane uncovers a truth that turns her devotion into unwitting complicity in a serious crime, she is forced to flee her utopia. Her quest for her true identity and the real story of her supposedly dead mother takes her to the one place her father warned her about most, the cutting edge of the modern world. This is a story about the messy, complex process of self-discovery and the shocking secrets that define who we are. The Walden Experiment, Isolation in Montana. Jane's earliest memories are framed by the towering ponderosa pines and the constant, rhythmic labor of survival in the isolated mountains of Montana. It was the mid-1990s, but Jane lived in a timeless bubble, far removed from cassette tapes and dial-up tones. Her world was defined by the strict, almost monastic philosophy of her father, Elias. He was a man of intense, magnetic charisma, whose core belief was that modern civilization, especially its rampant consumerism and creeping technological dependence, was a corruption of the human spirit. Their life was a deliberate, self-sustaining protest, a subsistence garden, heat sourced solely from the wood stove, and education drawn exclusively from classic philosophical texts, particularly the transcendental works of the 19th century. Jane's schooling consisted of parsing Thoreau and Emerson, a curriculum that lauded nature and eschewed knowledge that came from a wire or a screen. Elias often spoke of their past in hushed, regretful tones. He explained that they once lived a compromised, urban life in the Bay Area, but that Jane's mother, a bright, modern woman, had tragically died in a sudden car crash. That single defining tragedy, Elias maintained, was what propelled him to take Jane off the grid, to protect her from the society that had stolen her mother and threatened to corrupt her soul. He positioned their isolation not as a flight, but as an ascent, a moral superiority achieved through simplicity. For years, Jane accepted this reality entirely. Elias was her whole world, her teacher, her companion, her protector, and her God. She internalized his principles, viewing the few outsiders they encountered with the suspicion Elias taught her. Their cabin was her entire universe, a place where ethical clarity was achieved through hard work and intellectual rigor. Yet, even in this supposed paradise, the foundations were shaky. Elias was intensely controlling, and his trips down the mountain for essential supplies were always shrouded in secrecy, always followed by a mood of deep, guarded introspection. Jane was taught self-reliance, but she was never granted true autonomy. She grew up with an unshakable devotion to her father, convinced that their life was pure, beautiful, and necessary, and that the only danger lay in the civilization he protected her from. The cracks in the utopia and the serpent of knowledge. As Jane transitioned from child to teenager in the austere beauty of the Montana wilderness, the cracks in Elias's meticulously crafted utopia began to widen. The theoretical purity of Thoreauvian philosophy clashed violently with the hormonal restlessness of adolescence. She started to yearn for the trivial, forbidden things Elias railed against: music, fashion, other teenagers, the messy, arbitrary details of contemporary life. Elias's books, once gospel, began to feel like chains. She was intellectually advanced, capable of debating Kant, yet cripplingly ignorant of common social etiquette or basic world history beyond Elias's curated version. The subtle signs of Elias's deception became harder to ignore. Their self-sufficiency was often exposed as a lie. The supplies Elias brought back were too plentiful, too high quality to be bartered goods. More troubling was the sheer anxiety that governed Elias whenever the outside world pressed in, even indirectly. A distant helicopter or a casual mention of a forest ranger could trigger days of paranoid silence. Jane started noticing that their cabin was surrounded by small, almost invisible security measures, traps and alarms that spoke not of an ascetic philosopher, but of a man desperately hiding. Her curiosity about her mother intensified, driven by a growing instinctive doubt about the official narrative of the car crash. Elias would only ever provide frustratingly vague details about their time in the Bay Area, always cutting off questions about his wife's personality or career. Jane began to piece together fragments: a faded photograph hidden inside a hollowed-out book spine, a mention of Silicon Valley in a forgotten newspaper clipping. These clues suggested a vibrant, professional woman utterly incompatible with the image of the passive domesticity Elias projected onto her. Jane realized that her father's paradise was not a retreat from the world for moral reasons, but potentially a hiding place. A terrifying prospect that suggested their isolation was less about philosophy and more about fear. The serpent of knowledge had entered Jane's Garden of Eden, and it whispered of betrayal and secrets. Accomplice to a crime and the flight to San Francisco. The slow-burning psychological tension exploded one cold, ordinary morning. Elias's trips down the mountain had become more frequent and lengthy, and his paranoia was reaching manic levels. Jane's curiosity finally overcame her loyalty. One afternoon, while Elias was gone, she broke the rules she had lived by her whole life, prying open a locked, hidden chest in his floorboards. The contents were a horrifying confirmation of her worst fears. Inside was not money or gold, but a collection of meticulously organized, damning evidence. False identity papers for both of them, dozens of faded newspaper clippings detailing a high-profile white-collar crime from the late 1990s in the Bay Area, and, most chillingly, a set of documents that proved her father had faked her mother's death. The car crash was a lie. Her mother had simply disappeared, presumed dead shortly after a massive financial scandal involving Elias. Jane realized her father hadn't rescued her from society. He had kidnapped her and forced her to become an accomplice in his life on the run. The realization culminated in a devastating confrontation. Elias returned, discovering the open chest, and in the ensuing panic and emotional collapse, he confessed not just to the deceit about her mother, but also to his final, most horrifying act. He had recently committed a horrific, violent crime on his latest trip. A desperate, fatal attempt to silence someone who had finally tracked them down and threatened to expose his decades of lies. Jane's devotion instantly fractured. The utopian philosophy was a facade for a life of evasion, selfishness, and violence. Her entire existence, her purity, was a lie built on her mother's fabricated death and her father's criminal desperation. With her father temporarily incapacitated by the emotional breakdown, Jane made a split-second definitive choice. She fled. She left the only world she had ever known, carrying only the hidden documents and the one solid clue she possessed: the fact that her parents' real life lay in San Francisco, the very city Elias had taught her to despise. Landing in the digital Wild West, San Francisco shock. Jane's arrival in San Francisco was a seismic culture shock. The year was now late 1990s, and the city was a chaotic, brilliant explosion of the nascent digital age, a place of blinding lights, non-stop noise, and overwhelming information flow that directly contradicted every principle Elias had drilled into her. The sensory overload was almost paralyzing. She was intellectually equipped to dissect Nietzsche but couldn't operate a bus schedule or comprehend the purpose of a desktop computer. She was an illiterate in the language of the modern world. She found herself adrift in the heart of the dot-com boom, where wealth was being generated at lightning speed, and everyone spoke a cryptic language of bandwidth, startups, and going viral. She initially clung to her father's philosophies, shunning the consumerism, suspicious of the screens, but her survival depended on adapting. She slowly learned the essential mechanics of modern life and, crucially, began to engage with the technology Elias had so fiercely forbidden, the internet. This fledgling internet became her unexpected salvation and the tool for her quest. It was clunky and slow, accessed through public libraries or generous strangers, but it was an unparalleled window into the world Elias had sealed shut. Jane's search began with the simple, heartbreaking query: her mother's name. The internet, the supposed root of all societal evil, offered her the first glimpses of the woman she never knew, confirming that her mother was indeed alive at the time of the supposed crash. Jane's isolated, pure existence was over. She had exchanged the tyranny of nature for the terrifying, liberating tyranny of information, and the journey into her mother's real life had just begun. Unmasking the mother, lies, tech, and betrayal. Jane's deep dive into her mother's life quickly became an obsession, a frantic attempt to replace the ghost story with a real person. She discovered her mother, whose name was Eleanor, was far from the quiet wife Elias had portrayed. Eleanor was a brilliant, ambitious figure connected directly to the booming tech world in the Bay Area, working for a major corporation or perhaps a disruptive startup. The contrast with Elias, the anti-tech fundamentalist, was stark and immediate, suggesting a profound and irreconcilable conflict at the heart of their marriage. Using her father's hidden documents and the power of early search engines, Jane pieced together the financial scandal that was the true cause of their flight. Elias had not merely been escaping society, he had been the central figure in a massive fraud or corporate espionage scheme. The car crash narrative wasn't just to hide from the public, it was a way to make Eleanor disappear as a key witness or a potential informant. The documents suggested that Eleanor had not only not died, but had likely betrayed Elias, collaborating with authorities or the company to expose his crimes, forcing him to flee with Jane to Montana. This realization was agonizing. Her father was a narcissistic criminal who used philosophy to justify kidnapping. Her mother, the object of her current quest, was not a victim, but an active participant in the chaos, a professional woman who chose her career in justice over maintaining the family unit, leaving Jane to the dubious care of a fanatic. Jane felt a crushing sense of profound double betrayal. The complexity of her mother's choices, balancing survival, ambition, and moral obligation, was difficult for a girl raised on simple, black-and-white philosophical tenets. The further she dug, the more she questioned. Was technology the corruption Elias claimed, or was it simply a tool that exposed the true corruption in human nature? The reckoning, truth, progress, and forgiveness. Jane's quest reached its final, emotional crescendo when her sophisticated searches led her to Eleanor's current, quiet life. Her mother was indeed alive, living under an assumed identity, having made a conscious, painful choice to sever all ties with her criminal husband and her isolated daughter to ensure her own long-term safety and stability. The meeting was fraught with years of trauma, anger, and explanation. Eleanor confessed the truth about Elias's paranoia, his crimes, and the impossible choice she faced: either remain complicit or disappear to survive. The climax of the novel centers not on a physical fight, but on a deep moral reckoning for Jane. The knowledge she has gained forces her to abandon the black and white ideology of her childhood. She must decide what to do with the evidence of her father's ultimate horrifying crime back in Montana, the crime that forced her to flee. To expose Elias is to destroy the only parent she has ever truly known, a man she still, tragically, loves. To protect him is to embrace the life of lies and complicity she just risked everything to escape. Ultimately, Jane makes a mature, painful choice. She chooses the difficult, nuanced truth of the modern world over the comforting but corrupt simplicity of her father's paradise. She recognizes that life is not divided into the pure, natural world and corrupt technology, but is a complex blend of both, where morality is found not in isolation, but in connection. The ending sees Jane finding a tentative sense of peace, not through forgiveness of her parents' actions, but through the realization that she is now a product of her own choices. She embraces the city and the internet, the tools of the modern age, as the means to define her own, fully informed sense of self, stepping out from the shadow of the cabin and the philosophical chains of her father's failed paradise.